The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Senate had stood for 11,000 years. Its walls were cut from a single asteroid of black quartz, polished until it held reflections the way a held breath holds silence. 900 delegates sat in its rings, and beneath their feet, in the deepest vault of the station, sat the Accord of Species, a document older than most of the languages spoken above it. Nobody in that chamber remembered a session where the human delegate spoke first. That was, by design, not an accident. Ambassador Renata Voss sat in the outermost ring, the ring reserved for what the Senate's own charter called, without irony, provisional observers. She was 51 years old. Her hands were flat on the desk in front of her, the way they always were, and her breathing did not change no matter what was said about her species, her homeworld, or her right to occupy the seat she was sitting in. She had held that seat for 4 years. In 4 years, she had said perhaps 40 sentences on the record. Grand Speaker Threl Ovanis of the Kassavar Dominion stood at the center podium, and he stood the way men stand who have never once needed to check whether a door was actually open before walking through it. He was tall even for his species, plated in a deep violet chiton that caught the chamber lights like oil on water. And he wore the ceremonial collar of the third speakership, 7 rings of fused star metal, one for every species his predecessors had voted out of the accord. The sole delegation, he said, and his translator rendered the words in a tone of patient, procedural boredom, has failed to meet minimum contribution thresholds for the 4th consecutive cycle. He did not look at Voss. That too was procedure. Colonial output remains below Tier 9. Technological transfer remains non-existent. Military registry remains, and I quote the audit, unverifiable. A pause, performed rather than felt. The Sol system has contributed exactly 1 item of value to this accord in 40 years, a song. Laughter went around the outer rings, small and polite, the kind that costs nothing and means everything. Given this, Ovanis continued, the Kassavar Dominion moves formal proceedings to reclassify the Sol system as unaffiliated territory, effective immediately upon vote, pending resource reallocation. Reclassification was not a paperwork term. Everyone in that room knew what it actually meant. Unaffiliated territory had no accord protections, no trade guarantees, no non-interference clause. It meant Earth would become, on paper and in practice, a system anyone with a big enough fleet could walk into. Voss did not move. She did not stand to object. She did not request the floor. She sat with her hands flat on the desk and her breathing even. And somewhere in the second ring, a Velk observer leaned toward his aide and murmured that the human had finally understood her position. That was the story everyone told themselves later about that morning, that the human woman in the outer ring had gone quiet because she had run out of arguments. Nobody thought to ask why a species that had run out of arguments looked so remarkably rested. Ovanis called the vote formula onto the floor, a holographic tally already weighted, already counted in advance by delegates who had made their calls the night before over dinners that did not include her. The numbers began to climb. 400 in favor, 412, 430. Ambassador Voss, Ovanis said finally, almost as an afterthought, the courtesy extended to a corpse before the paperwork is filed. Does the Sol delegation wish to respond before a formal reclassification is entered? The chamber quieted, not out of respect, but out of the specific curiosity people reserve for watching something small get stepped on. Voss stood. She was not tall. She wore a gray coat that had been tailored 11 years earlier and had never needed replacing because she had not changed shape or rank since. Her hair was cut short and had gone the color of ash sometime in the last decade, though nobody in that chamber had been paying close enough attention to know when. She had one visible scar, a thin, pale line along her left jaw, and she had never once explained it, not to a Senate aide, not to a journalist, not to the two species that had tried to buy the story from her over the years. "No," she said. The translators rendered it flatly. One word. The Senate waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. Ovanes's mandibles clicked, an expression his species used for something between amusement and mild irritation. "No response, Ambassador?" "No," Voss said again and sat back down. The vote finished counting itself. 881 in favor, 19 abstentions. 0 opposed because the sole delegation held exactly 1 vote and had just declined to use it. Reclassification passed. Somewhere in the recording archive of that session, a recording that would be watched later more times than any other document in Senate history, a junior transcription clerk named Ilan Basar sat in the gallery above the third ring with a data slate on her knee, and she wrote, in the margin of her notes, a single line that was not part of her official transcript duties. She didn't even look angry. Ilan did not know yet that this line would be the first sentence of the only first-hand written account of what happened next that historians would ever fully trust. The Senate broke for recess an hour later, and delegates filed out through the long quartz corridor, discussing dinner reservations and the reclassification vote in roughly equal measure, as if the two were of comparable weight. Nobody noticed that the human ambassador did not join the exit line. She sat alone in the outer ring for 11 minutes, according to station security logs, her hands still flat on the desk. And then she stood, straightened her coat, and walked out through a side corridor toward the diplomatic docking arm, where a single ship, registered to no fleet and flagged under no known naval designation, waited with its running lights dark. The ship's name, stenciled small near the airlock, in a typeface nobody on the station recognized, was Quiet Water. Nobody thought that was strange. Humans, after all, had a habit of naming things after small, unthreatening images. A song, a river, a word for calm. It would be 411 days before anyone in that Senate learned what the name actually meant. To understand what happened in those 411 days, you have to go back 31 years to a room that no longer exists, in a city that has since been rebuilt twice, where a woman named Dr. Priya Anand sat across a folding table from 4 generals and told them something none of them wanted to hear. "They are not going to leave us alone," she said, "not because they hate us, because they don't see us at all." Anand was 38 years old that year, an atmospheric physicist turned strategic theorist, after first contact reduced every existing military doctrine on Earth to guesswork. She had a habit, colleagues remembered later, of tapping 2 fingers against the edge of a table when she was thinking, a small rhythm that stopped completely the moment she had decided something. Her fingers had stopped that day. "The Accord," she told the generals, "is not a peace treaty, it's an inventory system. Species get folded in when they're useful and reclassified when they stop being useful, and it can take them 40, 50, 80 years to notice they've stopped being useful, because the process is designed to look like patience." "So what do we do?" one general asked. "Wait?" "No," Anand said. "We build something they won't count." That was the entire founding thesis of what would later be called, in exactly one classified document and nowhere else, the Ledger Program. Not a fleet, not a weapon, a system built entirely outside every metric the Accord's audit protocols were designed to measure. Colonial output, registered military tonnage, technological transfer filings. Because Anand had done the math on the audit itself and found something the Cassivar Dominion's own auditors had never bothered to check. The audit only counted what was declared. "If we never declare it," Anand said, in the second paragraph of a memo that would not be read by anyone outside a 6-person committee for the next 29 years, "it does not exist, not to them, not to the Accord, not to anyone with the clearance to ask." 31 years is a long time to keep a secret between 6 people, and then 60, and then 400. But Anand had one advantage the rest of the galaxy had systematically underestimated for the entire span of human contact with the Accord. Humans were extremely good, as a species, at compartmentalizing grief, effort, and shame into projects that other people were never allowed to see. They called it, informally, patience with teeth. Anand did not live to see the vote in the Grand Chamber. She died 14 years into the program of an illness that had nothing to do with any of it. In a hospital bed with a window that looked out over a shipyard she had ordered built in a system with no name on any Accord star chart. Her last recorded words, according to the two aides present, were not dramatic. "Tell Voss," she said, "the math still works." Renata Voss had been Anand's student. Not formally, there had been no university course in what Anand was teaching, but she had sat in on committee sessions from the age of 26, had learned the rhythm of Anand's two-finger tap, and had inherited, along with the program's oversight, a single handwritten note that she kept, unfolded, in the same gray coat she wore into the Grand Chamber every session for 11 years. She had never asked Anand why she had been the one chosen to carry it. She suspected, in the quieter hours, that the answer had less to do with talent and more to do with a particular stillness Anand claimed to have noticed in her the first year they worked together. A stillness Voss herself had never learned to name. "You don't flinch when people underestimate you," Anand had told her once, in the same folding table room where the whole program had begun, though by then the table had been replaced twice and the room had been swept for listening devices so many times the technicians joked it was the cleanest room on the continent. "Most people flinch, it's involuntary. A little narrowing of the eyes, a little straightening of the spine. You don't do it. I've watched for it for 6 years, and I've never once seen it." "Is that useful?" Voss had asked, because at 29 she had still been young enough to ask questions like that out loud. "It's the only thing that will keep this program alive," Anand said, "because somebody is going to have to sit in that chamber for years, maybe decades, and be told to their face that they don't matter, and they are going to have to agree, on the record, in front of everyone, without ever once letting their face say otherwise." A short pause, the kind Anand allowed herself only when she meant the next sentence to be remembered. "That's not a diplomatic skill, that's a discipline. And disciplines have to be chosen early, before anyone's watching closely enough to notice you've started training for one." Voss had not understood, then, how literal that training would become. Over the following 9 years, before she ever held a Senate seat, she was rotated quietly through 3 separate postings designed less to build her a career than to build her a face. A trade delegation on a border world where every proposal she made was dismissed within minutes. A relief mission where a Casavar logistics officer had called her species resourceful in the way insects are resourceful, and a low-level observer post on a station not unlike the one that would one day hold the Grand Chamber, where she sat for 3 years without being permitted to speak at all. She was permitted on that observer post exactly 1 act of initiative in 3 years, and Anand had chosen it deliberately. She was allowed to file the reports. Weekly, dry, procedural reports, sent up a chain that nobody senior ever read, describing in exhaustive, tedious detail exactly which committees relied on which categories of the Accord's audit, and exactly which categories nobody thought to check twice. It was those reports, more than any single act of engineering, that had actually built the hole the Ledger program crawled through. Anand had known, from the beginning, that the weapon was never going to be the ships. The ships were only the shape the weapon eventually took. The actual weapon was patience applied with the precision of an audit. 3 years of a young woman sitting silent in a room, cataloging exactly how far a bureaucracy's attention did not reach. "They will never search your face for a plan," Anand told her, the day she handed over the folded note for the first time, "because nobody searches a face they've already decided is empty." She had tapped the desk twice, the old rhythm, and then stopped. Make sure it stays that way, even after, especially after. Voss had asked her, that same day, the only question she would ever regret asking, because she never got an answer she found satisfying. Not in the moment, and not in the 31 years afterward. What happens to the people who built it? When it's over, when everyone finally knows? Anand had looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone doing arithmetic she had already finished long ago, and was only now deciding whether to share the total. Some of them get remembered, she said. Most of them don't. That was true before we started, and it'll be true after we're done. The only thing that changes is whether the ones who aren't remembered mattered anyway. They will, she added, whether anyone writes it down or not. It was a harder answer than Voss had wanted, and it was, she came to understand much later, the truest thing anyone ever told her about the entire 31 years. Truer even than the arithmetic itself. 11,300 people had gone into the dark of Anchor Station knowing that answer in advance, and had gone anyway. And Voss had spent every session in that outer ring afterward, carrying it the way she carried the note, folded, close, never spoken of, but never once forgotten either. Nobody in the Senate had ever asked what was in her coat pocket. Diplomatic dress was not subject to search. That too had been a small, deliberate piece of the design. The note read, "They will vote. Let them." It changes nothing they can see. What the Accord's auditors had never checked, because the audit format itself had been written 4,000 years earlier by species who had never imagined an entire civilization choosing silence as a strategy, was the system 3 jumps coreward of Sol, a system with no habitable planet, no resource deposits worth declaring, and therefore no reason for any Accord surveyor to have ever filed a report on it. Humans called it, in the 6 documents that referenced it at all, Anchor Station. It was not a station. It was a shipyard the size of a small moon, built in absolute radio silence over 26 years by crews who rotated in and out under civilian cover stories, paid in a currency that did not exist on any exchange, and told, each of them, exactly 1 sentence before they signed on. This will matter more than anything else you will ever do, and no one will ever know your name for it. 11,300 people took that deal. Not for glory, not for a country, for a species that had been treated, since the moment of contact, like a slow child at a very old table. The ships built at Anchor Station were not counted in any registry because they were never named the way military vessels are named. They were numbered, in sequence, and painted the flat gray-black of deep space itself. And there were, by the day of the reclassification vote, 140 of them. 140 ships, 0 declared. The design philosophy behind them, according to the one surviving planning document Ilan Basar would later be permitted to read as part of the post-war historical commission, was almost insultingly simple. The Accord's naval doctrine, honed over 4,000 years of managing species that fought each other constantly and predictably, assumed that any serious fleet needed supply lines, needed bases, needed the kind of infrastructure a surveyor drone could spot from orbit. Humanity built ships that needed none of that because humanity had spent 31 years assuming it would never be allowed a supply line in the first place. "We are not building a navy," read one line from that document, attributed to an engineer named Halvard Ose, who had overseen propulsion design for 19 years and died, like Anand, before the vote that would prove him right. "We are building a species-length exhale. It only works if nobody hears us breathing in." 411 days after the reclassification vote, Renata Voss sat alone in the cockpit of Quiet Water, 3 jumps from the Black Quartz Station where 900 delegates had voted, unanimously among those who bothered to vote at all, to strip her homeworld of every protection it had never actually needed. She was not angry. Anger was not the shape this had ever taken. Not in Anand, not in Ose, not in the 11,300 who had built ships in the dark for a species that hadn't asked them to. It had never been anger. It had been arithmetic, patiently done, for 31 years, by people who understood that being underestimated was not an insult. It was cover. She opened a single channel, encrypted through a relay that did not appear on any Accord communication map, and spoke 4 words into it. The math still works. On the other end of that channel, 140 ships that had never been declared, never been counted, and never been seen began in absolute silence to move. Reclassification as a legal status took 90 days to formally process through the Accord's bureaucracy, filing amendments, boundary redraws, the quiet erasure of Saul's name from the non-interference registry. On day 91, the Velk Trade Combine, never a species known for patience once a system lost its protections, dispatched what their own logs would later describe as a routine asset survey to the outer edge of Sol space. 4 cruisers, unarmed by Combine classification, though every Combine cruiser carried enough plasma throw to level a continent if the classification committee had ever bothered to ask an actual weapons officer instead of an accountant. The Combine had done this 17 times before, in 17 other systems in the 90 days immediately following a reclassification vote. It was, within their fleet culture, barely worth a briefing. You sent ships, you surveyed, you reported back what was worth taking before anyone with a bigger flag showed up to take it first. Captain Ressa Thome commanded the lead cruiser, the 9th Ledger, an old ship, a proud one, 40 years in Combine service, and Thome herself had overseen 11 of those 17 prior surveys without incident. She did not expect Sol to be the 18th exception. Approach vector nominal, her sensor officer reported, a young Velk named Dessen, who had been in service 4 years and had never once seen a survey go sideways. No orbital defense signatures, no fleet presence, consistent with reclassification audit. Consistent, Thome repeated, and there was nothing in her voice yet to suggest she doubted it. Why would there be? The audit had said what the audit had always said. Empty, undefended, quiet. It was Dessen who saw it first, and the horror in what happened to him afterward was not that he saw it too late. It was that he saw it exactly on time, and there was nothing anyone could have done differently with that half-second of warning. "Contact," he said, and his voice had not yet found the register that would let it climb into alarm. "Multiple contacts. Correction, belay that. Recalculating." On the bridge of the 9th Ledger, in the seconds between Dessen's report and Thome's final order, there had been one other voice on the recording, a junior weapons officer named Barrow Kess, who had said nothing at all until the very end, because there had been nothing useful left to say. The recovered logs captured 9 seconds of him simply breathing, fast and shallow, the sound of a young officer doing the only thing left available to him, which was to notice with total clarity that he was about to die inside a story nobody back home would ever be told correctly. He had joined the Combine Navy 4 years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with Sol, had never once heard the system named in any briefing beyond a line item on a survey manifest, and would end his life believing, in the last coherent thought the recording preserved, that the audit had lied to him. It had not lied. It had simply never been asked the right question. That distinction between a lie and a silence nobody thought to break would come to matter more to the historians who studied the Sol interval than almost any tactical detail of the engagement itself. The 9th Ledger's own sensor logs, recovered 9 days later from a drifting debris field by an unmarked human salvage tender, showed something the Combine's official inquiry would spend 3 years trying not to publish in full. The human ships had not simply appeared from nowhere. They had been present, dormant, running on passive systems alone for 6 hours before the survey wing ever crossed into range, arranged in a formation that had clearly been rehearsed, adjusted, and rehearsed again, the way a choir rehearses a piece it has performed so many times that the counting has become instinct. Nobody aboard the ninth ledger had detected 6 hours of stillness because stillness, by its nature, produces nothing for a sensor to catch. It does not flare. It does not vent heat in a signature pattern. It simply waits, the way the note in Voss's coat pocket had waited, the way the whole program had waited for 31 years for exactly this kind of morning. Desson would say, in the one interview he ever gave on the subject, decades afterward, to a historian compiling accounts for what would become known simply as the Commission Archive, that the worst part had never been the 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It had been the 6 hours before it, the 6 hours his own instruments had spent staring directly at a wall of ships and calling it empty space, because that was what 31 years of patient, disciplined silence had trained the entire galaxy's instruments to see. "We were never blind," he said. "We were just looking at the only kind of nothing we'd ever been taught to recognize." The recalculation took 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Desson's sensor board went from a scattering of a dozen faint returns to a solid wall of contacts that filled the entire forward display. More ships than the ninth ledger's threat assessment software had a color code for, so that the display simply defaulted to flashing every contact in the same urgent red, as if the system itself did not know how to describe what it was looking at. "Captain," Desson's voice cracked on the word, and he would tell the story, decades later, as one of the few Velk officers who survived that day to tell any story at all, that the thing he remembered most clearly was not the number of ships. It was how quiet they were. No engine flare bright enough to have been hidden. No drive signature that matched anything in the Combine's 4,000-year archive of known hull classes. They had simply always been there, the way a held breath is always there, right up until the moment it isn't held anymore. 140, Desson said, and his voice had gone very small. 140 ships, Captain. They were already inside our formation. Thom's next order was the last order she gave as a serving officer of the Velk Combine, and by every surviving account, it was not delivered in panic. It was delivered the way a competent officer delivers an order she already knows will not be enough. "Full reverse, all channels, open distress." She did not finish the sentence. What happened over the following 6 minutes and 40 seconds, a duration that would be repeated so often in the aftermath briefings that it became, among Accord naval analysts, simply the Sol interval, was not a battle in any sense the Combine's doctrine had prepared for. A battle implies an exchange. What happened to the 4 cruisers of that survey wing was closer to what happens to a hand placed on a hot surface. Brief, total, and over before the nervous system finishes registering pain. The human ships did not announce themselves. They did not demand surrender, did not broadcast an ultimatum, did not perform the kind of theater that Accord fleets built entire propaganda departments around. They simply closed the geometry in a formation so precise it later took Combine tacticians 3 years to reverse engineer even a partial model of it, and fired only once each ship had a shot that could not miss. Desson lived because the ninth ledger's escape pod ejected automatically at the first structural breach, a design failsafe nobody had expected to actually matter that day. He watched, through the pod's narrow viewport, as the 3 other cruisers of his wing came apart in the kind of silence that space enforces on all violence. No sound at all, just light and then the absence of light where a ship used to be. He did not see the ninth ledger die. He was already tumbling away from it by then. But he heard, on the emergency channel that had not yet gone dead, 4 words from his own captain, spoken with a calm that he would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to understand. "They knew we'd come." The recovery ship that found Desson's pod 9 hours later was flagged under no Combine registry and no Accord registry either. It was gray-black, unmarked, and the 2 crew members who opened the pod's hatch wore no insignia at all. One of them, a woman with close-cropped hair going the color of ash, crouched down to Deson's eye level and spoke to him in careful, unaccented combine trade tongue. "You're not a prisoner," she said. "You're a witness. We need at least one." Deson would later identify her, from a photograph shown to him during the post-war commission hearings, as Ambassador Renata Voss. He never forgot that she had not smiled when she said it, not out of cruelty, out of something closer to respect, the specific respect one professional extends to another who has just watched something that mattered. News of the Saul interval reached the Grand Chamber 11 hours after it happened, delivered first not through official Combine channels, which took a full day to admit anything had gone wrong at all, but through an independent trade relay that had picked up scattered distress fragments and pieced together, incorrectly in some details, but correctly in the broad shape, that a Combine survey wing had been annihilated at the edge of a system the Senate had just voted 91 days earlier to strip of protection. Grand Speaker Ovanes received the report in his private office, standing at the same posture he always stood at, and for the first time in recorded Senate history, a detail confirmed later by 3 separate aides present in the room, his mandibles did not click. He simply stood very still, reading the same 3 lines of the report over and over, as if repetition might change their content. 140 ships, he said finally, to no one. Where were the survey drones? Where was the audit? 91 days and nobody saw a single hull. Nobody had an answer, because the answer was not something the Senate's instruments had ever been built to find. You cannot audit a silence. You can only, eventually, hear what it was hiding. By the time the full Senate reconvened, 6 days later, the scattered fragments of the story had solidified into something closer to a shape, though still an incomplete one, assembled from Combine survivor accounts, independent trade relay recordings, and one photograph, grainy, taken from a wrecked sensor buoy, of a formation of gray-black ships that matched no known registry, moving in a pattern that Accord tacticians would spend the next several years failing to fully model. Ilan Bassar sat in the gallery above the third ring again, data slate on her knee, and this time the chamber was not quiet in the bored, procedural way it usually was. It was quiet the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has independently done the same math and arrived at the same number and is waiting for someone else to say it first. Ambassador Voss walked in through the main entrance, not the side corridor, and took her seat in the outer ring exactly as she always had. Her coat was the same coat. Her hands went flat on the desk exactly as they always did. Nobody laughed this time. Grand Speaker Ovanes did not open with procedure. He opened, for the first time in his tenure, with a question that had not been on any agenda. "Ambassador Voss," he said, and his voice had lost the bored cadence entirely, replaced by something more careful, the tone of a man choosing each word as if it might detonate. "The Senate requests clarification regarding the incident at the edge of the Sol system, 6 days past." Voss stood. The chamber held its breath the way 11,000 years of quartz walls had learned to hold sound, and every delegate in every ring understood, in that silence, that whatever she said next was going to be the only thing anyone remembered about this session. "You reclassified our system," Voss said. "Under Accord law, reclassification removes non-interference protections. It does not remove our right to defend sovereign territory. The Combine sent an armed survey wing into that territory without consent or notice." A short pause, not for effect, simply because that was the rhythm she had always spoken in. "We defended it." 4 cruisers, Ovanes said. 140 ships. "Ambassador, this Senate was informed, repeatedly, over 4 decades, that the Sol system possessed no meaningful naval registry." "You were informed of what we declared," Voss said. "You never asked what we hadn't." A murmur went through the chamber, and this time it was not the murmur of polite laughter. It was the murmur of 900 delegates realizing, roughly simultaneously, that the audit format they had trusted for 4,000 years had a hole in it large enough to hide a fleet through. Where? Ovanus asked, and for the first time his voice carried something that was not quite fear, but was standing very close to it. Did 140 warships come from, that this Senate never once detected? Voss did not answer immediately. When she did, it was in the flattest possible sentence, the kind the Senate's own translators rendered without any inflection at all, because there was no inflection in the original to render. We built them, she said, quietly, for 31 years. Nobody spoke. Ilan Basar's stylus, according to her own later account, hovered over her data slate for 11 full seconds before she managed to write anything at all. 31 years, Ovanus repeated, very slowly, as if the number itself required translation. You have been building an undeclared fleet for 31 years, while this Senate debated whether your species contributed enough to merit continued protection. Yes, Voss said. Why? It was the first genuine question the Grand Speaker had ever asked her. Not a procedural challenge, not a rhetorical flourish for the chamber's benefit. An actual question from a man who had just watched 4 cruisers vanish and wanted, for reasons that were perhaps more personal than political, to understand why. Because we did the math on your audit, Voss said, the same year you started asking whether we were worth the trouble. And the math told us that a species which is only protected for as long as it's useful isn't actually protected. It's on a schedule. We didn't know when the schedule would run out. We only knew it would. A pause. So we stopped waiting to find out and started preparing for the day it did. And if the day had never come, Ovanus said, if this Senate had simply continued and never voted to reclassify you, what then? 31 years, 11,000 people, 140 ships, for a threat you weren't certain would ever arrive. Voss's answer, when it came, was the line that would end up quoted, translated into 41 languages, on more than one memorial wall within the decade. Then it would have been the best kind of preparation there is, she said, the kind nobody ever needed. She sat back down. Her hands went flat on the desk. The vote to reverse Saul's reclassification passed later that same session. 802 in favor, none opposed, 98 abstentions from delegations too shaken to commit to a position yet. It was, by any procedural measure, an overwhelming and immediate reversal. Nobody in that chamber believed, even for a moment, that the vote was really about procedure. Word of the Saul interval reached ordinary rooms across 100 worlds faster than any Senate bulletin ever could, because that is how word of a shaken order always travels. Not through official channels, but through the static of 1,000 smaller conversations, each one slightly wrong in its details and entirely correct in its shape. On Threxa Minor, in a market stall that sold pressed fruit and second-hand data cores, an old vendor named Sethivarl, 3 limbs, a trade tongue thick with a border world accent, heard the story from a courier who'd heard it from a combine deckhand who'd heard it from someone who claimed to know someone on the 9th ledger. By the time it reached Sethi, the number of human ships had grown to 300, and the number of combine survivors had shrunk to 1. But the core of it had not changed at all. A small, quiet species that everyone had voted to abandon had turned out to be holding something nobody had ever thought to ask about. Sethi set down the fruit he was weighing, and for a long moment did nothing at all. Then he reached under his stall counter and pulled out a small carved token, the kind border world traders keep for luck or memory, worn smooth from decades of handling, and he placed it without ceremony on the small shrine shelf every stall on Threxa Minor kept for ancestors in old debts. Good, he said to no one, in a dialect the courier didn't understand and didn't ask him to translate. Good that someone finally had teeth. In a records office on Valk Prime, an analyst named Corin Adeth pulled 17 years of combine survey reports, the exact 17 prior routine asset surveys of newly reclassified systems, and sat with them long after her shift had ended, cross-referencing dates in casualty columns that had never before seemed connected to anything but bureaucratic housekeeping. She found, in the 14th report, a single line she had read a dozen times before without understanding it. A note from a junior officer, dismissed at the time as overcaution, recommending expanded threat modeling for reclassified Tier 9 systems, pending further data. The recommendation had been filed, stamped, and forgotten. Corin closed the file. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, she drafted a memo of her own, addressed to nobody in particular, because there was no form in the Combine's entire administrative structure designed to receive an apology. Across 100 more rooms like these, a shipping clerk on Doral recalculating insurance premiums for any vessel bound anywhere near Sol Space, an academy instructor on Ganthier Reach quietly rewriting a lecture on minor species doctrine she had taught unchanged for 19 years, a child on a border colony asking her grandmother whether the story about the Quiet Fleet was true and being told simply that it usually is when nobody laughs about it twice. The same recalibration moved through the galaxy at the speed word travels, which is to say, faster than any fleet, faster than any vote, faster than any audit ever devised. 9 days after the reversal vote, Ambassador Voss requested and was granted an address to the full Senate, broadcast on every public relay the Accord maintained. It was, according to the broadcast logs, the single most viewed transmission in Senate history, watched or later reviewed by an estimated 40 billion individuals across 1,100 worlds. She stood at the same outer ring desk, not the central podium the Grand Speaker traditionally used for addresses. Aides had offered her the podium. She had declined. "I'm not here to give you a victory speech," she said, and her voice, carried across 100 worlds, was exactly the voice she had always used in that chamber. Flat, unhurried, entirely without triumph. "I don't think there's anything to celebrate in what happened at the edge of our system 9 days ago. 4 cruisers and a survey wing of people who were, as far as I know, mostly just doing their jobs. That's not a victory, that's a cost, and it's one we didn't choose, and one I wish, more than almost anything, we hadn't had to pay. For 31 years, she continued, we built something in silence, because silence was the only tool this Accord's rules left available to a species that had no other way to guarantee it would still exist in 50 years. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that was the right choice for every situation, or that other species should do the same. I'm only going to tell you why we did it, because I think this Senate has earned an honest answer, for once, instead of a diplomatic one. We did it because we learned, the hard way, that being small in this Accord means being provisional, reviewed, reclassified, measured against a bar that moves whenever it's convenient for someone bigger to move it. And when you learn that lesson early enough, you have 2 choices. You can spend your energy trying to convince everyone bigger than you that you deserve to stay. Or you can spend it making sure that, whether or not they agree, you get to decide the answer yourself. We chose the second one. I'm not offering you an apology for that, she said, because I don't believe we owe one. But I am offering you something else. A seat at the actual table, not the outer ring. Full Accord membership, not provisional status, with everything that requires of us. Declared registries, verified output, all of it, transparent from here forward. We're done hiding. We were only ever hiding because hiding was the price of surviving long enough to stop needing to. And I want to be honest about one more thing, she said, and here, for the only time in the entire broadcast, her voice slowed further, and the chamber, and 40 billion listeners across 1,100 worlds, leaned in without quite realizing they had done it. What we built was never meant to make us feared. It was meant to make sure we never again had to be afraid of a vote we had no power to stop. If the two end up looking the same from the outside, I understand that, but they are not the same thing, and I would ask this Senate to remember the difference. The next time it decides some small delegation in the outer ring isn't worth listening to. "That's all," she said. "Thank you." She sat down. There was no applause, not at first. Protocol did not call for it, and the chamber had, in any case, not yet found its footing after 9 days of recalibrating a 4,000-year assumption. But delegates across all 9 rings, one after another, began to rise, not in ceremony, simply because standing seemed, in that moment, like the only honest response available. Grand Speaker Ovanus was among the last to stand. When he did not speak. He simply inclined his head toward the outer ring, a gesture his species reserved, traditionally, for acknowledging a debt. The response that mattered most, though, was not recorded on any Senate feed at all. It happened 4 days later, on a border world called Mesquite Hollow that had never sent a delegate to any Senate session in its recorded history, where an elder of the smallest recognized species in the accord, a soft-spoken, six-eyed being named Torben, who had outlived 3 of her own children and every one of her original clan council, gathered the youngest of her community around a low fire and told them the story of the quiet ships, as she had heard it, in her own words, adjusted for a history that had taught her people, above all else, patience. When she finished, she did not offer a moral. She simply reached down, took a small handful of the fire's ash, once it had cooled at the edges, and pressed it into the center of her own palm, a gesture of her people reserved for the rare occasions history offered proof that waiting was not the same thing as losing. "Remember this one," she told the children, "not because they were strong, because they were patient." And it turned out patience was a kind of strength nobody had bothered to measure. Word of Torben's small ritual reached the Senate itself only as a footnote in a cultural affairs briefing, one line among hundreds, and yet it was the line Illenbasser chose to include, unprompted, in her own private notes, underlined twice, the only line in her entire archive of that period she ever underlined at all. Construction on what would become the Accord's first fully integrated human shipyard, declared, registered, open to inspection by any member species who requested it, began 8 months after the address, in the same system where Anchor Station had once existed in total silence. The new yard was smaller than Anchor Station had been, deliberately so because Voss had insisted, over the objections of at least 2 Senate logistics committees, that the point was never to build the biggest fleet possible. The point had always been to build exactly enough, and then to stop, and to let everyone see the stopping as clearly as they had once failed to see the building. It was slow work. Declared work always is. Every hull, every crew manifest, every propulsion test filed and cross-checked by auditors who were, for the first time in Sol's history, actually looking. There were delays. There were disputes over classification standards that dragged on for months. There were 3 separate incidents, minor ones, where border patrols from other species misjudged a human vessel's intentions and nearly triggered incidents that took careful, patient diplomacy. Voss's diplomacy, mostly, conducted in the same flat, unhurried voice, to walk back from the edge. It was, in other words, an ordinary, imperfect, unglamorous beginning. Nobody who worked on it would have called it a triumph. They would have called it, if asked, simply the next thing that needed doing. 4 years after the reclassification vote, 4 years, almost to the day, since Illenbasser had first written "she didn't even look angry" in the margin of a transcript she wasn't authorized to editorialize. Renata Voss sat alone in a small office aboard the new, declared shipyard, in a chair that had replaced 3 others over the decades, but had never once been comfortable enough to keep her working past midnight, which was, she had always privately thought, exactly the point of an uncomfortable chair. On the desk in front of her sat 2 things. The first was a data slate, open to a routine oversight report, the ordinary, unglamorous work of a species now fully inside the system it had once had to hide from. The second was a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from 35 years of being carried, unfolded, and folded again. She did not need to read it anymore. She had long ago memorized every word. They will vote. Let them. It changes nothing they can see. She thought, not for the first time, of Anand's two fingers, tapping and then stopping, of Osei's line about a species-length exhale, of 11,300 people who had signed on for a project that promised them nothing but the certainty that nobody would ever know their names for it, and had done it anyway, because somewhere in each of them was the same quiet arithmetic that had never needed to be spoken aloud to be understood. She thought too of Dessen, the young Velk censor officer who had sent her, unprompted, 18 months after the interval, a short message that said only that he had left military service, that he had taken up teaching at a small academy on a border world, and that he wanted her to know he did not hate her, or her ships, or the 6 minutes and 40 seconds that had taken his captain and half his crew. He had written, instead, that he had spent those 18 months trying to understand what kind of patience it took to build something for 31 years that you hoped, every single day, you would never have to use. She had written back 4 words. Now you know some. Outside her small office window, through reinforced quartz that had none of the black polish of the Senate chamber, and all of the plain, honest transparency of something built to be looked at rather than hidden, the new shipyard moved through its evening cycle. Declared vessels under construction, running lights bright instead of dark, hull numbers stenciled in plain sight instead of buried in silence. It was not finished. It would not be finished for years, maybe decades, and Voss had made her peace long ago with the fact that she likely would not live to see whatever it eventually became, any more than Anand had lived to see the vote, or Osei had lived to see the ships he designed finally move. That too was part of the arithmetic. Some debts you pay off, some you simply hand forward, a little lighter than you found them, and trust the next set of hands to keep counting. Voss folded the paper one more time, careful along the same worn creases, and set it back in the same pocket of the same gray coat she had worn into that chamber for 11 years, and would, she suspected, go on wearing for a good many more, not out of habit, but because a coat that has held a species' patience for that long earns the right to keep holding it. She picked up the data slate instead and went back to the ordinary, unglamorous work of the evening. A supply manifest, a training schedule, a border dispute that needed a careful, unhurried word rather than a ship, because that, in the end, had always been the actual shape of what 31 years of silence had been building toward. Not a fleet that never had to be used, a patience that, having finally been seen, no longer had to prove itself twice. Somewhere above her, through the quartz, the running lights of the new shipyard blinked on, one by one, in plain and open sight, exactly the way a species chooses to be seen once it has decided it no longer has anything left to hide. The math still works.